Welcome to the Seminole Wars. In this podcast, we explore how the Seminole Wars came to be, how they were fought, and how they still resonate some 2 centuries later. I am your host, Patrick Swan, and our show is a production of the Seminole Wars Foundation, found online at www.seminolewars.us. We are recording today from the homestead of the Foundation in Bushnell, Florida. Thank you for listening.
Dr. Joe Knetsch, welcome back to the second of our 2-part episode discussing fear and anxiety on the Florida frontier. In our first episode, we went into terrain and climate and a number of on-the-ground things that Seminole and soldiers suffered from. In this episode, we're going to look at a larger picture, some of the underlying causes that started the Second Seminole War. We'll look at some of the places and incidents where it was actually waged and why. And then we're going to look at strategy, the operations, the tactics, and how successful they were. So as we get started here, we'll take a look at the causes. It's tempting to attribute the Second Seminole War as starting solely because of the passage of the Indian Removal Act. No Removal Act, no war. But the causes, at least of the Second Seminole War, are more complicated than that in Florida. What part did miscommunication along the border with Georgia and Florida play in there even being a Second Seminole War?
Well, the constant raids back and forth that had been going on for years, as a matter of fact, going back to the late 1700s in particular, people seem to ignore that for whatever reason. Many years ago, I did a paper for the Florida Historical Society, which was published in one of the proceedings, dealing with the striving for cattle and land on which to raise the cattle, and this constant pressure. I alluded to that once earlier, but more specifically, the Wiregrass people in Georgia in particular definitely had, the land in northern Florida is very similar. You can almost say the border really doesn't exist when it comes to topography. It's only a political border. But for the most part, those people wanted to expand their cattle range further south, and they were willing to go to war to do that. And the constant raiding back and forth between Seminoles and Miccosukees, especially the Miccosukees along the area in northeastern Leon County and into Jefferson County, got to be pretty brutal. And so as a result, that it is one of the most violent frontiers when you take a look at it overall in American history. The area between Georgia and somewhat Alabama, but mostly Georgia and northern Florida, is a constant battleground since the days of the British and the American Revolution. So it's a long-term kind of thing. The area around Miccosukee was one of the more contested areas. As you recall, when Jackson came into Florida in 1818, one of his goals was to destroy the Miccosukee settlements up near Lake Miccosukee in northeastern Leon County, northeast of Tallahassee. I always try to remind people, as my friend Dale Cox has done a number of times also, they destroyed over 300 Indian houses. I want you to stop and think about it. That's more Indian housing units, if you will, than existed in all of St. Augustine or Pensacola. In other words, the settlement at Miccosukee was a larger settlement population-wise and housing-wise than the 2 largest towns in Florida at the time. People don't even think about it, but that's how much was destroyed at that point in time. And of course, the pushing further south, as we know, particularly under a number of the Georgia governors, Rabin and others, you had a real push to drive all the Indians out of Georgia and out of Florida, because that was an area gets into things like the raids for the cattle and raids for slaves and vice versa. People forget that Seminoles and Creeks and others did practice slavery also, and therefore it was a valuable piece of property to them. Whether it was as severe as anything in the white settlement, that's a total debate that I'll leave to Larry Rivers and Cantor Brown. It was a very severe thing in those areas, but the Seminoles and Miccosukees were much more attuned to a very lenient form of slavery, basically more like serfdom in the ancient world, in the old world. In other words, they paid tribute and we provide protection, etc., from anybody coming for you, which they did. And that, of course, is part and parcel of the same whole story. And I think we sometimes forget that slavery, cattle, land, shall we say, just envy for the, as I kind of pointed out earlier, the fact that many of the headmen of the tribes were actually living better than most of the Georgia settlers in the wiregrass frontier. There had to be a little envy that these quote-unquote savages, and that's what you always hear the word used all the time. How does anyone be a savage if you're practicing three-crop rotation, you're living in houses that are clapboard with cedar shake shingles, things of this nature, and using your European utensils, iron and some tin, and of course pewter if you're the upper class, like Macintosh or something like that. All of a sudden, these people are no longer savages. They're better than we are, kind of thing, and we're going to get even with them. We want what they have and then some. And a lot of that has to be put into it. So it's a tremendous conflict amongst various two different types of civilization, and I will call it civilization because, well, savages they're not civilized. I got news for you. These guys were. And it makes it a whole lot of difference when it comes to the attitude people have towards going to war or not going to war at that particular time. It all plays part, as you pointed out. It's a very complex thing, and it's continuous. Indian removal is 1830, but we've got raids going on in central Florida, say around the Gainesville and Ocala areas in the 1820s. 1826. Don't forget that we even have a settlement or a fortification up on the Suwannee River called Fort Duval. People don't even know about it, but it's there, or was there, and it was kept in time for about, I think it was 2.5, 3 months to basically try to control the Indians in that area and get them out of the area. And it was very, very scary. And not only that, but stop and think also that when Fort Brooke was founded in 1824, what was going on? And when you take a look at the post returns and the letters that Brooke sent, he's not going to send anybody further south of Fort Brooke because he only had 2 companies there. And he had heard that the blacks and natives in that area outnumbered him. And he was more afraid of them than he was anything else coming up and attacking Fort Brooke because he didn't have the manpower to control a fort that size. I mean, this is the kind of things, folks, this is long before the Seminole War. You've already got a major officer in which is now becoming Cantonment Brooke at the time, it became Fort Brooke, as we all know, actually worried about his command because they outnumbered and may have outdone his people.
When we talk about the Dade Battle and we say, well, this was the opening shot of the Second Seminole War, there were actually skirmishes and encounters going on before that, but just not as large an engagement.
Well, there were a number of them from local militia mostly. They would attack somebody's settlement and the local militia would get out and get 30 to 40 men and go riding off into the sunset and hopefully catch somebody, which most of the time they didn't. It already was apparent from the way the Seminoles reacted and the way they attacked. They already knew that if the Army got involved, they were not going to be able to fight full-blood skirmishes, European style or anything else. They were smart enough to know this is not what's going to win it for us or wear down the white man. And essentially that's was the overall, and I think the overall strategy of the Seminoles is simply wear them down. Make it so costly, make it so dangerous, make it so difficult that in the end they're going to give up. In this particular case, the Seminoles had already decided pretty much they knew they couldn't defeat an out-and-out army, so they were simply going to wear us down. And they came close. They did come close. And the military, as you know, it was so bad here that the officers, we had more officers resign their commission in, 37, 38, than any other time in West Point history because they did not want to come to Florida. Florida was a death trap, and they didn't want to come here. And I think that speaks volumes on just the reputation of the war and the problem of morale within the Army group itself, which is, again, something that, the Seminoles have to have a high morale because this is their land. Here's the Army being sent down there to essentially waste their lives going after, attempting to drive out people they can't catch. That's morale depleting, if there ever was one.
In your book, you write that the war was experienced differently in scattered locations throughout Florida. What do you mean by that?
Well, you take a look at the plantation economy of East Florida. 3 major plantations that were owned by Joseph Hernandez, general of the Florida militia, and overall commander of that group. And what you had at Spring Garden, one of the most profitable plantations in North America at the time. I mean, we're talking small fortunes here. These are a well-to-do planter class, a la what the English aristocracy might have desired when they had Florida, and the Spanish upper class tried to desire a little bit. The Americans had actually done it, and they were making some very profitable. Dummett Grove, Douglas Dummett's plantation, what we have at New Smyrna, etc. There were a lot of very beautiful places making a lot of money. All of a sudden, the war breaks out. Where they get hit by the Seminoles, and they got hit. By the time they got done, after the Battle of Dunlawton, which was commanded by Benjamin A. Putnam, he was out there with the Florida militia. They're not a well-trained unit. They're not well provided. Matter of fact, they provided their own weapons for the most part. Many of them were shotgun type of weapons, as a matter of fact. That's what you want to use in the bush anyway, isn't it? As we found out later. Again, we relearn these lessons all the time for some reason or other. So you had in East Florida, you had a plantation type of society, a la the old English aristocracy concept of a plantation. You get towards central, middle Florida, as we called it back then. Then you get into the cotton plantations. These guys on the East Coast were raising all sorts of things, including indigo, rice, those kind of things were still being grown even in the American era. But in the middle Florida, particularly you put Madison County all the way through the Red Hills country, you're talking cotton plantations, a la what you would find in Georgia, and did find in contemporary Georgia and Alabama, those that were prospering at the time. And they have a little bit different mentality. They also, of course, have large cattle herds, many of them. So you do have that going on. And then West Florida is a little different altogether. Matter of fact, you don't even talk about West Florida for the most part. I included an essay on the Creek War and / Seminole War in Western Florida that my friend Brian Rucker has talked about a number of times, been on. It's a different world out in West Florida. And matter of fact, they were still fighting as late as 1847. And we seem to forget also that the last surrender of the Seminoles was on the Occoquan River, just outside of Tallahassee, in 1843, when Ethan Allen Hitchcock finally took the surrender of Osofsky and his group. So it's that, and a lot of the smaller farms in the area around Tallahassee, Leon County, Jefferson County, especially Gadsden County, and somewhat into Jackson, those are more scattered kind of things. And boy, they got whacked. The Green Chairs families out, they get essentially, won't say totally wiped out because there were 3 survivors. I think 3 survivors. I don't remember the exact number. I think there are 3. That's when we get Chairs Crossroads, etc., just outside of Tallahassee here. They get, they're that close to Tallahassee, and they're getting wiped out. Gadsden County had constant raids on individual farms. They would, wait for them to be isolated, and then, pick their time, went out and hit the families and take care. It's a different type of war, as far as, they went after individual family units versus a large plantation with overseers and armed men every so often. It's what you would find in eastern Florida more than here. And then, of course, in those areas that were settled in West Florida, and there are not many, they get hit pretty well too, except for Pensacola. And I think there's a lot of the reason for that, of course, is that during the days of the Spanish, Pensacola was a major supplier of weaponry and lead, etc., to the Creek Confederation and the Seminoles in West Florida too. So they didn't have as much action out there, but the main part of the peninsula of Florida, isolation, ambush, knocking off letter carriers, things of that nature, were very, very common. Very frustrating for the citizens of Florida, white citizens of Florida, trying to make a living out here. When you can't even go outside without having to carry a weapon, and you better hope your family's old enough to fire one to at least try to provide minimum protection, because there's no army, and the militia, well, you're part of the militia. So it's a different. Each area had different specialties, and each one of them got hit differently depending on what the needs were of the Seminoles, who basically dictated how the first campaigns were going to be conducted against them. So you're going to have to run in catches, and of course the Army was not very good at doing it.
And you didn't mention, but it was important as well, South Florida and even Key West.
Well, yeah, Kiowaso, of course, was at one time very much under siege, and I have written on that too, of course. But I didn't really get into it because the southeast Florida, which I'm from Fort Lauderdale area, so originally, way back when, that was one of those areas that was into county production and making flour. Bill Cooley and his family, which were massacred on New River while he was out wrecking the Gil Blas Spanish vessel that was sunk off Fort Lauderdale, what we now call Fort Lauderdale. There was no fort at the time, by the way. So, and some of his neighbors saw or heard the shooting and the killing of the Cooley family. They got picked up because they're isolated. Cooley, of course, was a justice of the peace, and one of the Indians had been killed by another white settler in some kind of trade dispute. We don't really know the exact nature of it, but Cooley did not act in at least as far as the Indians were concerned, the Seminoles of that area did not act fairly, did not give them justice, which was a different version of justice than what whites were supposed to practice. And the guy got off, and they took it out on Cooley. They killed his entire family and his tutor. And that happened just 8 days after the Dade battle. So it gives you an idea that was, again, another thing that was probably timed to spread terror throughout the areas of Florida. And that was part of the, I think, overall strategy, too, is you hit Ocala, you hit the Dade Command, you hit the plantations in East Florida, and you hit the Southeast Florida. You're showing that we can hit you anywhere you are. And I think that mentality was brilliant, first of all, as a military strategy. And it also, of course, makes the whites divide their forces if they're going to try to find them. And it makes them easier to isolate and fight in small units.
Which community would you say was hardest hit, or can you say?
I can't see any particular one, but as far as the economic values of the day, East Florida. With the loss of all those, Hernandez lost 3 plantations of great size. I've already mentioned Spring Garden, how well that was doing. We're talking of bringing in an income of $500,000 a year. I mean, that's a lot of cash. It was a very, very prosperous plantation. That got wiped out. Dumbest plantations, all of these major things are rather strident as far as the people are concerned of what's going on. So it's important.
Throughout the long conflict, the policy of the U.S. government, the policy of the U.S. government did not change. It was Indian removal, whether it was peaceably or forcible. And something that makes surprise people is, so they'd have big battles and they'd capture Indians, and they didn't just execute them. They actually said, okay, now we've got you and we're shipping you off. So the policy of Indian removal stayed throughout, but some folks looking at this, some on the battlefield mused and some in Washington City, also mused that extermination should have been the policy. How do we reconcile that there were people there who had personal views of extermination and yet carried out the government position of removal?
Well, if they're in the military, they're taking orders, and they followed them. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. especially when it comes to saving lives or sparing lives, which in this particular case would be more the latter. But it's one of those things that an individual has to make the decision at a particular time. And surprisingly, don't forget, and you've seen the letters, and I have too, and John and Mary Lou, when they put out the Vinton Diaries, there's a lot of empathy for the Seminole cause by white officers. And they're not going to carry out an extermination policy if they can absolutely in every which way possibly avoid it. They thought that was inhuman. They thought they were against the war, many of them, as you well know. It was a situation where, morally, where are you going to come down on? What side are you going to come down on? And I think the officer class showed some class, as a matter of fact, in actually carrying out the removal policy. Many of them were aware of the brutality of the shortages that were constantly being foisted on the Army and the Indians by the various traders along the way, and the fact that they weren't supposed to take the blacks if they were with the Seminoles, but all the people out, basically they're out hunting blacks to put them back into slavery. They're out there. They could care less about what the Indians, they wanted the slaves because they could sell them. The Indians would be rebellious, even though we had enslaved Indians for eons from Florida and New England, etc. That was not a new context at all. But they were looking primarily for African laborers because that's what they needed and that's what they desired. And by golly, we're going to get it. And if we exterminate the Indians, so much the better. That was a lot of attitude that way. But the officer class that actually had to carry out the policy did a respectable job that way.
How much merit is there to that argument that this was a de facto war of extermination as opposed to one where there were isolated cases?
I don't think that it wasn't a war of extermination. I really don't, because of the fact that even though Jessup had some personal animosity against individual leaders of the Seminole group, they had betrayed him, he thought, embarrassed him as a commanding officer, etc. He still went through with the removal. He didn't condone, and they actually prosecuted some individuals under his command for violating that, for killing Indians in outright cold blood. So, I mean, there's nothing black and white, as you know, in any of this history, other than the fact that there are whites and there are blacks, and there's, of course, reds in fighting each other,
right,
or fighting with each other, for that matter.
In certain aspects, the protracted Second Seminole War was one of attrition, and in other aspects, it was one of exhaustion. Which is more accurate in your view, or might you say it was both at the same time? Attrition and exhaustion.
Well, attrition, you basically wear down. The whole concept of attrition is you're going to wear down and eventually eliminate your enemy. Either they're going to surrender, and you're not going to be able to exist under the constant pressure. Exhaustion, we just keep on fighting until we fall down from exhaustion, or basically end the war because we can't accomplish what the goal is. In the end, it sounds like a fine line between the two, but it isn't. Attrition is a bona fide strategy in war. We used it a lot, especially the First World War, which I just finished writing about. Yeah, that was brutality against brutality. There, it was unbelievable the more you read about it. But in this particular case, I think this was more of an exhaustion. We were going to fight until we were exhausted. And when they did finally negotiate, or try to negotiate in 1842, they didn't sign a treaty because it was never going to be presented to tribal council, that's for sure. But they basically said, okay, we're going to agree not to fight if you agree not to fight. And the Seminoles, of course, were happy to do that. They've been fighting all these years. It wasn't bad enough they'd had to fight the Creeks. Now they have to fight the American government for all these years straight through, too, from Andrew Jackson's invasion further south. It's a long-ass war. And people don't realize that this is really a continuous conflict from the get-go. From the what we call the First Seminole War, you can trace that back to the destruction of the Negro Fort. You can go even further back into the various problems that we had with Spain, etc. I mean, there's a continuum here, This is a long process. This is not something that's easily defined and say, okay, this is going to be it. It just didn't happen that way. There was nothing that was quick about it, and so the exhaustion, I think, is a better argument in reality, because attrition means you're going to force somebody to give in because you have eliminated all the options for them. Well, we never eliminated all of the options for the Seminoles.
We can agree the U.S. government strategy was to remove the Seminole from Florida, and how they actually did it was a matter of operations and tactics. Before I go into a question about that, I wanted to see if you can differentiate between a strategic view, an operational view, and a tactical view for how you conduct your campaigns.
First of all, operations are a relatively new concept from the 1970s and 80s. Based on stuff they observed with the Soviet Union, believe it or not, if you want to get into operations. But the operational side of it is basically what you have. The tactics are the things that you use to fight individual battles, and how you go about setting up your system for supplies, replacements, repairs, that kind of thing. And then, of course, the tactics of are you going to sucker them into a trap? Are you going to do a surprise element? The kind of tactics you choose to win a particular battle, which goes into the concept of an operation, which modern day, the operations are basically larger scales of planned campaigns. You've got to win this battle, and this battle to accomplish this part of the operation, which is part of the strategic goal, which is the overall end game in what's going to happen here.
How well did the U.S. government do strategically in this regard, then?
Pathetic would be a nice word. They really didn't have a strategy other than sending numbers and sending the troops into the area and letting the local commander, like Scott or somebody else, make those decisions about how they're going to accomplish the goal. The end game was basically to get the Seminoles out of Florida. However, how to do it was never really contemplated. Jackson, of course, who was the president at the time, he already knew how to do it, or at least he thought he did. And he, of course, had a really pathetic appreciation of what the local militia people can do. He had no use for them, for the most part, even though he had been a militia leader almost his entire career. But those were people he knew and had personal loyalties to him. But he had really no idea how good or bad the local militias were, especially here in Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. He had some idea about Alabama, of course, but he was not too impressed with what was going on. The regular Army guys despised the militias and did not work well with them. Winfield Scott, as you know, was hung in effigy here in Tallahassee when he left Florida, because he just simply said they were a bunch of lazy women who basically could not fight, would not fight, and want American American soldiers' lives to be sacrificed for their personal profit and benefit. People in Florida didn't take kindly to that kind of attitude. Needless to say.
One could say, and it's a larger concept, which is grand strategy. The U.S. had a grand strategy, which was Indian removal in the southeast, and then open up all that land to settlers, sell that land for huge profits, which then pays off the national debt. But strategically, it seems more like they were presented with the Dade battle, and so instead of thinking of a reasoned, carefully thought out strategy, it was, let's go get revenge, let's do a punitive operation, all towards, and we're definitely going to have to militarily take them and remove them from Florida. But it doesn't seem like they actually thought about a larger picture of, after we do our punitive stuff, if we did leave them in a certain area, we could not spend so much money and we could get about our business. They invented the strategy to address the fact that they were angry about being attacked by the Seminole.
Well, I'm not even too sure I would agree with a lot of that, but I'm not too sure they actually had a quote-unquote strategy. When they knew that the end game was going to be the removal, but getting to that point, then we get down to the operational level, did they really have an idea of how that was going to be done? And probably the most thoroughly planned campaign was the 1837-38 Jessup campaign, where he had the 4 prongs. He basically had them. He had the group with Zachary Taylor coming down to Kissimmee in that central part of Florida. He had Hernandez and friends on the East Coast. Jessup himself was going to bring them down the St. Johns River, and of course Percival Smith and his Louisiana group, plus about 800 people total, were going to come up the Caloosahatchee and basically entrap them in the Everglades area. Obviously, the only and we shouldn't forget, of course, the little minor detail of setting up Fort Poinsett down in Cape Sable area, and where Dr. Lawson, the Surgeon General of the Army, was in command with a field command, if you can believe that. Don't recall Lawson ever fighting another battle, frankly, but he was a medical man, and not a bad one for the day. Logistically, it was a nightmare. The boats that he had asked for were not built in time, or they weren't built correctly, and they didn't work in the Florida. They were too deep of draft to be able to navigate the waters that he wanted to have those vessels on. And of course, the fact that they were trying to, about the only major thing that came out of that was the Battle of Lake Okeechobee on Christmas Day of 1837. And that was, as we know, tactically one of the biggest blunders. Strategically, it didn't have anything to do with the strategy per se, but it did have a lot to do with the operational end of it, at least entrapping the Seminoles enough to cause a major European-style battle, which, if that were a European-style battle, which we all have to laugh at, we lost 128-9, or we really don't know exactly how many Seminoles were killed or injured, whatever, but it was a well-planned retreat. The canoes were waiting on the banks and to take everybody out of there quickly, and I think it was 120. I think was the loss of the American Army in that battle. Lost a lot of good officers, and it was just a total. It just doesn't make Zachary Taylor look like a really great general.
What would you say was the Seminole strategy throughout the war? It might have evolved or adapted, but the basic strategy, if we're to say, what were the Seminoles trying to do?
Well, basically, it was a guerrilla warfare in the usual, in the real sense of the word. It was a Fabian kind of philosophy. Keep on fighting and then delaying and retreating. Fight, delay, retreat, and that was the way they were going to survive. They kind of knew that from the get-go. Is that a strategy? Yeah, if the Fabian kind of warfare is a strategy, then it was a strategy. But I think the biggest strategy they had overall, the grand plan, was survival, and that was the best way to do that under the circumstances.
To get survival, they had to get the Army to leave them alone. If the Army left them alone, they can survive. And so all these things would be done to get the Army to see that, as we say, the lemon wasn't worth the squeeze. They didn't need to continue fighting here because they weren't going to remove the Seminole as a whole. And it was going to be someone else at a reckless cost of blood and treasure. And when the Army would finally realize that, then maybe they'd pick up and go home. And then those Seminole who were there could live in peace.
Well, essentially that worked when you stop and think how many Seminoles were left at the end of the Second Seminole War here. It's a sad situation, but essentially the Seminoles did exhaust the United States enough that they left knowing full well that Sam Jones and a number of others were still out there. Yeah, Billy Bowlegs finally had to surrender, but on Bowlegs Creek in Fort Myers, by the way, in 1858, they still had a viable enough group of Seminoles and Miccosukes left, and Tallahassees, as they sometimes called them, up by Lake Pierce, that they survived. They did survive. The unconquered Seminoles, I think, is what Brent Weissman has called them, or Passy West. They have preserved.
One could say that both sides declared success, but it was something of a pyrrhic success for both sides. The Army, of course, took all those casualties and spent all that national treasure and still didn't get all the Seminoles. But with the Seminoles, if we say that there were 5,000 at the start of the conflict and you have 200 left in small little hamlets in the Everglades, I have a problem defining that as a great success. They paid a terrible, terrible price, although in the end, their success was maybe we'd say better than the Army's because they were still there.
Essentially, was there an option after the end of the Second Seminole War? What was their option?
We might say the lesson of the Seminole War is don't get involved in an Indian removal war with the Seminoles. What lessons do you draw from the Second Seminole War?
First of all, I look at the improvement of logistics that anyone studying military history can learn from the Seminole War. I mean, I'm just looking at a very narrow focus there, but the things that Jessup attempted to do and couldn't get accomplished because of and here's, by the way, people forget he's the quartermaster general, and he can't get stuff delivered on time. And we've never, ever in American history delivered on time when it comes to all the necessary things. That's our military history. Also, the fact that every time we finish a war, we cut back the military. I'm going back to the days after a war to a point that it becomes ridiculous that you cannot respond quickly enough at the next crisis. It's an amazing history that we continually do not learn these lessons.
I would say the lesson of the Second Seminole War, the lesson of the Second Seminole War is we'll quickly forget the lessons of these wars as soon as they're over if we didn't really want to be in them in the first place.
Exactly. That is a very good lesson.
What is your greatest surprise in studying the Second Seminole War or the Seminole Wars in general?
Basically, how sophisticated the Seminole and Miccosukee people were and are. They're very intelligent. They are adaptable. Yeah, I think those kind of lessons about how sophisticated some groups were and not others. I think I love looking at the logistical side because there's a lot to be learned about what Jessup attempted but didn't succeed in getting, and how that could be changed and all those kind of things. And of course, the worst lesson of all was the corruption of all those people who constantly supply the military with defective and watered-down goods.
Last question, Joe. Given the culture of the times, in your opinion, was the Second Seminole War inevitable?
No, I don't think so. And I think you had indicated earlier in some of the questions and some of our dialogue back and forth that, there's a whole lot of wasteland down the south end of the state that let them go down there and as Jessup had suggested, and was rejected not once but twice by Poinsett. They said, no, we're not going to let them off. We're not going to let them go down there. If they had left them down there in the Everglades or south of, say, the Polk County, Orange County line area, south of that, I think it was a possibility that they could have survived and thrived down there, and who knows what would have happened later on if they'd amalgamated or whatever. It wasn't inevitable. I don't think too much in history is inevitable other than life and death, and taxes, of course. But it's one of those things that could have been avoided.
Joe, we're out of time. Thanks so much for your astute observations.
Anytime, Patrick. Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. We'll be in touch.
If you enjoyed this show, please take a moment to like us on Facebook at Seminole Wars Foundation. Leave a review on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider. Your reviews and comments help new listeners discover us and help us keep the show going. Visit our website at www.seminolewars.us for blogs, articles, news, books, events, membership information, and how to subscribe to this podcast. We'll be back soon with a new episode of the Seminole Wars Podcast. The Seminole Wars Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to preservation, education, and publication of Seminole Wars history throughout the state of Florida. This podcast is copyrighted the Seminole Wars Foundation 2021. All rights reserved. Front bumper music, The Devil's Garden, Roast 'em, provided by kind permission of Reedy Youngman. Back bumper music, Second Seminole Win, by Jed Merrim and Ricky Pittman, courtesy of Ricky Pittman. All rights reserved.